Welcome to How To Plant-Based, where I show you how to use and create plant-based basics. Today is episode 6, and we are showing you how to make the perfect flaky vegan pie crust. Now, if you have been around here for a while, then you know I am not the baker of the duo here. However, if I can make this vegan flaky pie crust, then so can you, friends. Before we get into the recipe, I want to give the biggest tip of all for making the perfect pie crust every single time, and that's you want to keep your ingredients cold. So I have frozen the fat that we will be using, and then our ice water is also cold. If you are new to baking, you can even chill your tools. So that would be your rolling pin, your pastry cutter or forks, and even your bowl. You can throw into the freezer 30 minutes before you start making this recipe just to make sure everything is cold. It will make the process a lot smoother until you get used to making pie crust over and over again. So to make the perfect pie crust, we only need 5 ingredients. I don't know why I was using both hands for 5, but just 5 ingredients. We are going to be using flour. We're using an all-purpose flour. If you are gluten-free, you can use a 1-to-1 gluten-free flour for this recipe. You just want to make sure that it has xanthan gum inside of the ingredient list. We are also using salt. It is just sea salt, and that is to help enhance the flavor of the pie crust. We are using vegan sugar, just granulated cane sugar. And not only does the sugar help with the sweetness, but also it helps with the baking process. Sugar helps with that browning of the crust that you see. You want that perfect golden brown crust every single time, but it also helps to make the dough more pliable, which makes it easier to roll out, which is better for all of us. We're also going to be using ice cold water. You can see the ice inside of here. You want it to be ice cold like Andre 3000 for those of you who get that reference. You don't want to use water out of the tap, and you don't want to just get some water out of your fridge. You need it to be ice cold for this recipe to work as best as possible. And then finally, we are going to need a fat. We are using vegan shortening, or also known as vegetable shortening. It is literally just some Crisco. For those that don't know what I'm talking about or think that there's no such thing as vegetable shortening, there is. It's just your regular old tub of Crisco. Also, the butter flavor is also vegan if you want to use some of that butter flavor inside of there. I could do a whole video on the difference between using vegan butter versus shortening, but I will try to keep it simple. Shortening has a higher melting point, which makes sure that your crust stays tender while also cooking evenly, which leads to a flakier crust every single time. If you are going to use vegan butter, because that is what you have accessible to you, you want to make sure that you are using sticks of vegan butter and freezing them. You also want to make sure that water is not the first ingredient inside of your vegan butter, and you want to make sure that you never use a vegan butter spread, ones that you can like scoop out of a tub or something like that, because they won't stay firm enough in order to make your flaky pie crust every single time. Last tip before we jump into the actual recipe is that at any point during your pie making process, if you feel like your ingredients are getting warm or you need to step away for a minute, there's no problem just popping wherever you're at in the process into the fridge and letting it chill until you can come back to it, or letting it chill until it can get cold again. So if you need to mix your flour and salt and sugar together, pop it into the fridge, come back to it, you can do that. If you feel like you have touched the dough too much, while you're adding the water or the shortening, you can pop it into the fridge, or even for a couple of minutes. Anytime you feel like you need to, you can do that. If you are making pie and it is the summertime, it is definitely needed to pop it into the fridge for a few minutes every once in a while, just so you can keep all of your ingredients cold. All right, so getting into the recipe, I am going to be doing this by hand. If you have a food processor, you can also do this recipe. This is definitely one of those recipes that you want to be using a scale. Scales are like $10 now, guys, at the store, so highly recommend that you getting one, especially if you're going to be making a lot of pies. So the reason for that is because you can massively mismeasure by just scooping out your flour, and you really want to keep the same flour to butter ratio. You also don't want to do that when you are baking something like a pie crust. So if you're going to be doing a lot of baking, highly recommend that you get a scale so you can have the same measurements every single time, and then you're not worrying about, well, why did one come out and one didn't come out, something like that. Once we have measured our flour, we are just going to add in our salt. as well as our sugar. And then we're just going to combine that with a fork until we think that it's pretty well combined. You're gonna be combining this with a pastry cutter with everything else, so you don't have to overly worry about getting it all mixed together, but you definitely wanna make sure that it is stirred together and not all just in one clump on top of your flour. So from here, we are going to be using our fat. In this case, we are using vegetable shortening. It is already pre-scooped out into tablespoon-sized portions. You wanna just make sure it's in tablespoon rather than just one big clump of fat inside of your flour. That way it just helps it get more evenly dispersed faster. We are going to be using a pastry cutter for this recipe, but you can use 2 forks if you want to do the same concept. You really want to try to avoid using your hands because most people's hands are warmer than you actually want it to be. If you're somebody with super cold hands for some reason, then maybe, but still I would try to avoid using your hands as much as possible inside of something like a pie crust. So we're just going to drop those tablespoons inside of here. And then we are going to use our pastry cutter and just start cutting our shortening into our flour. We are trying to make sure that the shortening is basically pea-sized crumbles, that your mixture resembles a sand-like texture. Okay, so once we have our dough looking sand-like, it's crumbly, we are going to add in our ice-cold water. You're going to do 1 to 2 tablespoons at a time. I always start with 2. Now, if you measured your dough out correctly, it should be pretty much the same amount every single time. However, if you just scooped it out, this could alter a little bit. What we are looking for is our dough to be hydrated, but not overly wet. You don't want slimy dough or dough that kind of just like slides off your hand. We're not looking for that. We just want all of our flour to be hydrated. I like to do this with a spatula. And you can see pretty quickly whether or not you are going to need more water. The biggest thing here is that we don't overwork our dough as well. Again, we want all of our dry flour pieces to be hydrated, but we do not want it to be over slimy, and we don't want to overwork our dough because we're not trying to knead our dough. We don't want it to be tough or dense. We want to keep that flakiness, and we're going to do that by just hydrating enough, just working it enough to get to that. You're gonna need about 4, maybe 5 tablespoons here. You're not really gonna go more than that. You can also do this with ice cold non-dairy milk if you would want, but you wanna keep it to something like that. Once your dough is hydrated, it is okay if it looks shaggy, if it still looks a little crumbly. You just don't want to see any big pockets of flour. What we're gonna do is start pressing this together and forming it into somewhat of a ball. Again, you don't really want to use your hands too much here. Okay, so from here we are going to wrap our dough into plastic wrap and place it in the fridge for 1 to 2 hours. What that's going to do is keep all of our ingredients chilled. It is going to help hydrate our flour that is inside, especially if you have any dry pockets that maybe you cannot see. And then what that's going to do is make sure we get that optimal flakiness that we are looking for inside of our pie crust. Okay, so after your dough has chilled, you are going to take it out of the cling wrap. I made double the amount of the recipe, so we are going to cut this in half. If you only made one of the recipes, then you don't have to worry about that. Now we are going to get, we need a little bit of flour, and we need a piece of parchment paper. If you don't use parchment paper, then you can just do this straight on your countertop. But what we are going to do is sprinkle a little bit of flour down on the bottom and the top. You don't want to do a lot because you don't want to dry out your dough. We just chilled all of it, but just a little bit so it doesn't stick. And then we are also going to add just a little bit to our rolling pin as well. And then we are going to roll it out and then keep rotating. Not great at geometry when I was in high school. However, I think this is a 45-degree angle. And we are going to roll this out to a circle. You want your circle to be about 2 inches bigger than whatever pie crust or pie pan, this is the crust, that you are using. So if you're using a 9-inch pie crust, you want about 11-inch circle. If you're using an 8-inch pie crust, then you want it to be a 10-inch circle. Okay, so once you feel like it is big enough, you can take your pie pan that you are using, put it face side down, and then you should have enough of a border around here that feels like 1 to 2 inches. If not, you can just take it off and re-roll it a little bit more. The reason I like to use parchment paper so much is because we are going to do the flipping process all at one time. If you aren't using parchment paper, just doing it on your counter, you can roll your crust up into your dough, up onto your rolling pin, and then place it over in your pan like that. But I find this way to be much easier. You just flip, carefully remove your parchment paper, and then it is already in your pie pan, nice and easy. You do want to make sure that you are being careful when you are doing this. One tip that Andrew gave me when he was first teaching me how to do a pie crust was to start at the non-creased side. So if you have any parts that creased inside of your parchment paper, you can do those first, and then the rest should come off nice and easily once you do that. What you are going to do from here is make sure you gently push down into the bottom of your pie pan. If there's any parts that are overlapped right here, you're just going to gently push those in. And then do that against the wall as well as the bottom. And then once you feel like you have done all of that, then we can start to talk about the top. So since we only have a little bit of an overhang here, what we're going to do is take up that little bit of crust, and we are actually going to just fold it into our pie crust, just like that, and you're gonna keep doing that around the entire border. If there's any places that are cracked, just put a little bit of water on your finger and you can rub that on and seal the crack. One of the best things about a pie is that it really only matters what filling you are putting inside of it and the taste of the dough. People aren't necessarily as worried about what your crust looks like. Especially if you're putting a lattice top on time. So if it is your first time making a pie crust, don't worry too much about it being absolutely perfect. It's okay, and it is pretty forgiving. I just want to show you real quick, we have like a crack right here. All you want to do is grab a little bit of water, moisten that just a little bit, and then rub it into your pie crust or your pie dough that is already that it looks fine, and then you just rub it in there, and then it is perfectly good like normal. So obviously you are free to leave your crust smooth like this. However, if you want to do a type of design, you are not going to put a lattice crust on top or some type of crust on top, and you're just going to leave it like this. You can do a simple trick with a fork, kind of like you were doing like a peanut butter cookie. So you're going to crisscross your fork movements to where you're doing basically horizontal and then vertical, horizontal, then vertical. The other method that is probably the more infamous one that you usually see with pie crust is the pinch finger method. So you're just gonna pinch your thumb and your pointer finger together on one hand, and then use your pointer finger from the other hand and push into your pinch. And then slowly move your finger around until you go all the way around your pie crust like that. Overall, the most important thing right here is that you are having fun with it. It doesn't have to be the perfect looking pie crust unless you're entering a pie baking contest, and then maybe we should do a couple of them before you enter that. However, it is perfectly ready to go into the oven. What you wanna do here, if you are adding a filling or a lattice top, you're gonna add your filling and then put your lattice top on top. We'll talk about that in a second. If you are doing a pie crust that needs to be par baked or pre-baked, that really you use those if you have like a quiche or a runnier crust. What you're going to do is you can add your parchment paper back in here and use pie weights, or you can use dried beans, or you can do something called docking, which is literally a fancy term for you're just gonna poke your fork all through it like you would do a baked potato. So you wanna do the whole bottom of the crust, and you also want to make sure you're going to do the sides as well. And what that's doing is allowing the steam to escape. And before we put it in the oven, the only other thing that I want to mention is you do kind of want to go through this process as fast as you can, but you don't want to go too fast where you mess anything up. And that's just so that your pie dough stays as hydrated as possible and doesn't dry out before you get it into the oven. So let's go bake it. What you have here is a perfectly golden crust that you will get every single time It is flaky, it is tender, it has that crisp texture. As you can see, it just crumbles. It has those flaky layers that you are looking for inside of the perfect pie crust. I do just want to mention, because I forgot to say it earlier, if you do want to store this pie crust, as soon as you wrap it in the plastic wrap, you can keep it in the fridge for up to 5 days. You can also move that into a freezer safe bag or container and leave it in your freezer for up to a month, and then just let it thaw before you continue to proceed with the rest of the recipe. If you want some inspiration for what you should fill your pie crust with, we are going to pop some images up here on the screen. I hope that you enjoyed making this pie crust with me and you perfect it every single time. If you do, send us a picture on Instagram and tag us at Make It Dairy Free so we can share your pie recipes, and we will see you in the next video. Have a great week. Bye.